I can't feel my legs. Please, I can't feel my legs. Those words did not come from a woman or a man hardened by the brutal streets of Chicago. They came from a voice so small, so fragile, that it seemed the howling wind would swallow it whole before it could even reach a human ear. But on this night, a night where the polar vortex turned the city into a graveyard of ice and glass, those words pierced through something thicker than a blizzard. They pierced through the reinforced bulletproof glass of a moving fortress. Stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happened on that frozen street changed more than just one life. It unraveled a web of secrets that reached the highest towers of the city. If this story touches your heart, please give it a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe to the channel to support my work. I truly count on you to help me share these narratives of hope and justice. Inside the custom-stretched Maybach, the air was a perfect 72 degrees, scented with the faint, expensive aroma of Italian leather and aged Scotch. Arthur Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with the very skyline he looked out upon, didn't even glance at the window. At 58, Arthur was known in the press as the Iron Architect. It was a title he wore with a grim sort of pride. He had spent 3 decades building Sterling Global into a real estate empire by following a single cold rule: efficiency over everything. He had climbed to the top by clearing out what he called unproductive neighborhoods, tearing down crumbling community centers and low-income housing to make room for gleaming spires of chrome and glass. To the world, he was a visionary. To himself, he was a man who had successfully replaced his heart with a ledger. His eyes were fixed on a tablet, watching green lines climb upward. Profit margins were soaring. A multi-billion-dollar merger was just days away, a deal that would cement his legacy forever. And yet, as the car crawled through a slush-clogged side street near the Loop, a strange restlessness stirred in his chest. It was a phantom pain, like a limb that had been amputated long ago, but still itched in the cold. 30 years ago, Arthur hadn't been an iron architect. He had been a young man in a small town, a man who promised a woman named Elena that he would build a world for them. But the city had called to him with a siren song of power, and he had chosen the shadow of greatness over the warmth of her hand. He told himself he was doing it for their future, but in the end he had only built a vault for one. The car lurched. Marcus, a driver who had served Arthur for 15 years without ever missing a beat, slammed on the brakes. The heavy vehicle skidded slightly on the black ice, the anti-lock brakes groaning against the weight of the armor. Arthur looked up, a sharp reprimand on his lips, his hand already reaching for the intercom to demand an explanation. He was a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute, and a delay was an insult, but the words died in his throat. There, bathed in the blinding, clinical white of the LED headlights, was a figure that shouldn't have existed in this weather. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She stood in the middle of the street, her small body shaking with a violence that looked like she was trying to vibrate out of existence. She wasn't wearing a parka or boots. She was dressed in a thin, tattered summer dress that might have been yellow once, now stained grey by the city's filth. Her hair was a matted nest of ice crystals, and her skin was the colour of a winter moon. But it was her feet that made Arthur's blood turn to ice. They were bare, completely bare against the frozen slush of the Chicago street. They weren't just red from the cold. They were a terrifying, bruised shade of blue. She looked like a ghost that had wandered out of a nightmare. A small broken bird trapped in a polar vortex that was currently killing people in heated homes. Arthur's first instinct was his professional one. He reached for his phone to call his private security detail. This was a liability. This was a tragedy, yes, but it was someone else's problem. The city was full of the displaced, and he had spent his life making sure he never had to look at them. But then the girl's knees buckled. She didn't fall. She simply collapsed, as if the last thread holding her upright had been cut by the wind. And then came the cry. Through the layers of soundproofing, through the heavy steel of the Maybach, her voice reached him. I can't feel my legs. Something inside Arthur Sterling snapped. It wasn't a slow realization. It was a violent fracture of his entire world view. He didn't wait for Marcus to come around and open the door. He didn't think about his $5,000 wool coat or his bespoke suit. He lunged for the door handle and threw himself out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The wind, known as the hawk in this city, tore at his lungs, making every breath feel like he was inhaling needles. But he didn't stop. He ran into the slush, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the freezing mud. He fell to his knees beside the girl, the wet cold soaking into his trousers instantly, but he didn't feel it. He reached out and scooped her into his arms. She was unnervingly light, It felt like holding a handful of dry leaves. Her skin was so cold it felt like it was burning him, a heatless fire that seeped through his clothes. She wasn't crying anymore. Her eyes were half closed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. Arthur pulled her against his chest, trying to shield her with the heavy wool of his coat, his own body heat acting as a desperate flickering candle against the vast darkness of the storm. As he lifted her to carry her back to the car, something snagged on his sleeve, a small, rusted silver locket hanging from a thin, frayed string around her neck, caught on his cuff and snapped. It fell into the dirty snow, clicking open as it hit the ice. Arthur paused, his breath hitching in the sub-zero air. He looked down and saw a grainy, hand-cut photograph staring back at him from the locket's frame. The world seemed to stop. The wind grew silent. The honking of distant cars faded into a dull hum. The photograph was of a young woman with a soft smile and eyes that held the light of a summer afternoon. They were the exact same eyes as the girl in his arms, eyes that Arthur had seen every time he closed his eyes for 30 years. It was Elena. His heart, the one he thought was made of iron, began to beat with a frantic, painful rhythm. This was impossible. This was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the sudden shock of the cold. But the girl's face, even under the mask of frost and suffering, was a perfect mirror of the woman he had left behind in a dusty town in Indiana. He looked at the locket again, then back at the girl. She was whispering something, a word so faint it was barely a vibration against his chest. Mama. Arthur didn't say a word. He didn't ask Marcus for help. He climbed back into the Maybach with the girl clutched to his heart, shouting at the driver to move. Forget the office, forget the merger. Go to the private medical wing, now. The car roared to life, its tires spinning for a second before catching grip and racing away from the dark alleyway. Inside the cabin, Arthur wrapped the girl in a cashmere throw, his hands trembling as he tried to rub warmth back into her frozen limbs. He watched her feet, those tiny, blue feet, and felt a crushing weight in his lungs. He was a man who built towers that touched the clouds, yet he had never felt so small, so utterly powerless. As the city lights blurred past the window, Arthur stared at the silver locket he had snatched from the snow. It was a cheap piece of jewelry, the kind you buy at a county fair, but to him it felt heavier than all the gold in his bank accounts. He began to realize that the girl's presence here wasn't a random act of fate. It was a reckoning. For years, he had signed papers that moved people like chess pieces, clearing blighted areas to make room for progress. He had never once thought about where the pieces went when they were taken off the board. Now one of those pieces was dying in his arms, and she had the eyes of the only woman he had ever truly loved. The mystery of who she was and how she ended up barefoot in a polar vortex was a shadow looming over him, a shadow that suggested the empire he was so proud of was built on a foundation of more than just concrete. It was built on the very lives he had considered unproductive. He looked down at the girl, her name, Maya, as he would soon discover, written in the small faint heartbeat against his ribs. The iron architect was gone. In his place was a man terrified of the cold, realizing for the first time that the walls he had built to keep the world out had only succeeded in trapping him in a winter of his own making. And as the car pulled into the emergency bay of the most exclusive clinic in the city, Arthur Sterling knew that the storm was only just beginning. He had saved her from the snow, but he had no idea if he could save her from the truth of what he had become. He clutched the locket tighter, the metal biting into his palm, a silent promise to a ghost that this time he wouldn't let go. The private medical wing of Sterling Global was a cathedral of silence, a place where the air was filtered to a surgical purity and the lights were calibrated to a soothing amber glow. It was a facility designed for the elite, for the men and women who thought they could buy their way out of mortality. But as the double doors swung open, the sterile peace was shattered by the frantic boots of a man who looked like he had crawled out of a shipwreck. Arthur Sterling, the most powerful real estate mogul in the Midwest, was trembling. His hands, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar contracts without a flicker of hesitation, were shaking so violently he could barely hold the small frozen bundle in his arms. Medical staff in pristine white coats rushed forward, their faces masks of professional calm that quickly cracked when they saw what Arthur was carrying. It wasn't a fellow executive or a wealthy donor. It was a child, a girl whose skin was the color of a bruised plum and whose breath was a rattle that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. They whisked her away onto a gurney, the wheels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Arthur tried to follow, but a firm hand on his shoulder stopped him. It was Dr. Aris, the head of the facility, a woman who had seen the inside of Arthur's heart during his annual checkups and knew it was as cold as the wind outside. But as she looked at him now, She didn't see the Iron Architect. She saw a man whose soul was leaking out of his eyes. "Mr. Sterling, you need to step back," she said, her voice a sharp command. "We need to raise her core temperature slowly. If we go too fast, her heart will stop. You've brought her from the brink of a frozen grave. Let us do our work." Arthur collapsed into a chair in the waiting room. He was still wearing his salt-stained wool coat, the hem soaked with the dirty slush of the Chicago streets. He looked down at his hands. They were stained with the girl's blood, small nicks from the ice, and the grime of a world he had spent 40 years trying to pave over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted silver locket. It felt heavy, like a lead weight pulling him down into the depths of a past he had tried to bury under layers of concrete and steel. He clicked it open again. The face of young Elena stared back at him. It was a photograph taken in a different life, in a sun-drenched field where the only thing that mattered was the promise of a future together. He remembered the day he gave her that locket. He had told her it was a token of a life they would build, a life of warmth and safety. Instead, he had used that ambition to build a cage of gold for himself and a wasteland for everyone else. But how did this girl have it? Who was she? Arthur didn't wait for the doctors to give him answers. He pulled out his phone and made a call he hadn't made in years. He called Elias, an old fixer from his early days, a man who knew how to find the things the city tried to hide. "I need a trace," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. "A girl, 7 years old, found near the old community center on 4th and Main, and I need to know everything about a woman named Eleanor Vance and her daughter." While he waited, the silence of the hospital began to feel like an accusation. Every beep of the heart monitor from the room down the hall felt like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of a life he might have already destroyed. He began to pace the floor, his mind racing. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. From this height, the people looked like ants, tiny specks of life scurrying through the snow. He had always enjoyed that view. It made him feel like a god. Now it made him feel like a monster. He realized with a jolt of horror that the community center where he found the girl wasn't just any building. It was part of the Sterling Heights development zone. He had ordered that center closed 6 months ago. He had called it an eyesore in a board meeting, a sinkhole for company resources. He had authorized the private security teams to clear the perimeter so the demolition crews could move in. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just found a girl in the snow. He had found a victim of his own blueprints, but the nightmare was only starting. An hour later, his phone buzzed. It was a digital dossier from Elias. Arthur's hands shook as he swiped through the files. The girl's name was Maya. Her mother was Sarah Vance, Elena's daughter. Sarah had died 4 months ago. The cause of death was listed as a respiratory infection that turned into pneumonia. It was a treatable condition, something a simple round of antibiotics could have fixed, but the local clinic in their district had been shut down. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs as he read the address of the closed clinic. It was another one of his efficiency targets. He had lobbied the city to pull funding from that specific block to increase the property value of his nearby high-rise project. Because he wanted an extra 3% on his quarterly dividends, a young woman had died in a drafty apartment, leaving a 7-year-old girl to fend for herself in the ruins of a neighborhood he was tearing down. Maya hadn't been a runaway. She had been a squatter in the very construction site that was supposed to be Arthur's crowning achievement. She had been hiding in the basement of the Sterling Heights project, living on scraps, terrified of the men in suits who came to check the progress of the revitalization. "Mr. Sterling?" Arthur looked up. Standing in the doorway of the waiting room was Julian Vane, the COO of Sterling Global. Julian was 34, sharp-featured, and wore a suit that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary. He was Arthur's protégé, the man Arthur had handpicked to carry on his legacy, because Julian possessed the one thing Arthur thought was a virtue, a total absence of sentimentality. Julian didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. "Arthur, what are you doing here? We have the pre-merger gala in 4 hours. The board is asking why you disappeared from your car. Marcus told me, well, he told me you had a bit of an episode on the street." Arthur stood up, his eyes cold. "An episode, Julian? I found a child dying in the slush. A child who was living in our construction site because we tore down her home and closed her clinic." Julian sighed, the sound of a man explaining something simple to a child. "Arthur, let's be realistic. Those districts are transition zones. There are always casualties of progress. It's unfortunate, but it's the cost of doing business. We have a $5 billion merger on the line. If the investors think you've gone soft over a stray kid, the stock will plummet before the sun comes up." Arthur looked at Julian and saw a reflection of himself from 20 years ago. It was a terrifying sight. She isn't a stray, Julian. She's family. In a way you wouldn't understand. Julian's expression shifted. The fake empathy vanished, replaced by a calculating sharpness. I think I understand more than you realize, Arthur. I've been keeping an eye on the nuisance reports from the Heights project. My security team mentioned a girl. I told them to handle it quietly. I didn't want you distracted by some ghost from your past. Arthur stepped forward, his voice a low growl. You knew she was there? You knew a 7-year-old was living in a basement during a polar vortex, and you did nothing? I did what was best for the company, Julian replied, his voice flat. I paid off the local social workers to keep her off the books. If she had been processed, the news would have picked up the story of a homeless orphan living in a sterling global site. It would have been a PR nightmare. I figured the cold would eventually solve the problem without us having to get our hands dirty. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Arthur realized that the man standing in front of him wasn't just his successor. He was the final evolution of Arthur's own cruelty. Julian had simply taken Arthur's philosophy to its logical, murderous conclusion. Get out, Arthur whispered. Julian didn't move. Arthur, think about what you're doing. You're emotional, you're tired. Go home, change your suit, and show up at the gala. I'll have the girl moved to a state facility tonight. They'll take care of her. It'll be like this never happened. I said get out, Arthur roared, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. Julian straightened his tie, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. As you wish, Arthur. But remember, you built this empire on the idea that the weak are an obstacle. If you suddenly decide to become their champion, don't be surprised when the empire decides you're an obstacle too. As Julian walked away, Arthur turned back toward the glass doors of the intensive care unit. He could see the doctors huddled around Maya's bed. She looked so small amidst the forest of tubes and humming machines. He realized then that he was at a crossroads. He could follow Julian's advice, bury the truth, and keep his billions. Or he could face the ruins of his life and try to salvage the one thing money couldn't buy. But the choice wasn't going to be easy. He knew Julian wasn't just threatening him, he was preparing a coup. And as the sun began to set over the frozen city, casting long bloody shadows across the snow, Arthur Sterling understood that to save the girl with the silver locket, he would have to burn down everything he had ever built. He walked toward Maya's room, his heart heavy with a guilt that felt like a physical weight. He reached out and touched the glass. I'm sorry, Elena, he whispered to the empty air. I'm so sorry. And that was only the beginning of the storm. He had no idea that Julian had already set a plan in motion that would turn the entire city against him. Arthur thought he was fighting for a girl, but he was about to find out he was fighting for his very soul. What would you do if you realized your greatest success was built on the suffering of those you were supposed to love? Would you walk away, or would you stay to fight a battle you were almost certain to lose? Tell me in the comments what you would do in Arthur's shoes, and don't forget to stay tuned for the next part of this journey. The truth is about to come out, and nothing will ever be the same. The sterile hum of the private wing was a haunting contrast to the chaos swirling inside Arthur Sterling's mind. He stood by the window of the intensive care unit, his reflection a ghost against the dark Chicago skyline. Down there, the city was a grid of cold, unforgiving light. Up here, a 7-year-old girl was fighting for the right to breathe. Maya had finally drifted into a restless sleep, her small body nearly swallowed by the high-tech bed and the forest of plastic tubing. Her feet, once blue and frozen, were now wrapped in thick, medicated bandages, a sight that made Arthur's stomach churn with a guilt he couldn't name. But the silence was a lie. Outside these glass walls, a war was beginning. Arthur's phone buzzed incessantly. It was a barrage of emails and urgent texts from the Sterling Global Board of Directors. The rumors were already spreading. Sterling has lost it, one headline in a financial blog whispered. The Iron Architect abandons billion-dollar merger for a street urchin. Arthur ignored them all, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of the silver locket on the bedside table. He was waiting for one thing. He was waiting for Maya to wake up. When she finally did, it wasn't with a cry or a scream. Her eyes simply fluttered open, wide and dark, reflecting the amber glow of the room. She looked at the ceiling, then at the machines, and finally her gaze settled on Arthur. He froze. He had stood before world leaders and ruthless competitors without blinking, but under the gaze of this child he felt stripped bare. "Are you the king?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, a mere thread of sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Arthur's bones. Arthur leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The king? No, Maya. My name is Arthur. I'm the man who found you. A small, sad smile touched her pale lips. My mama told me about the king, she said, her eyes drifting to the silver locket. She said he lived in a castle of glass and light. She said he was a great man who forgot he had a heart, but one day he would come to save us. She said he'd bring the spring back. The words were a serrated blade, cutting through the last of Arthur's defenses. He realized then that Elena had never hated him. Despite the abandonment, despite the 30 years of silence, she had turned him into a fairy tale for her daughter and granddaughter. She had kept his memory alive, not as a man who left, but as a hero who was just lost. And he had repaid that devotion by closing the very clinic that could have saved her daughter's life. He felt a sob rise in his throat, a hot, choking thing he had to swallow back. But the moment of connection was shattered by the heavy thud of the suite's double doors. Julian Vane marched in, followed by 2 men in dark suits and a woman carrying a leather briefcase. The woman didn't look like a doctor. She had the sharp, cold eyes of a career bureaucrat. Julian didn't even look at the girl in the bed. He looked only at Arthur, his expression one of bored impatience. "This has gone on long enough, Arthur," Julian said, his voice echoing in the small room. "Meet Ms. Henderson from Child Protective Services. And these are our legal consultants. We've reviewed the situation, and since there is no legal record of your relation to this child, she is being remanded to state custody. Immediately." Arthur stood up, his stature imposing even in his rumpled suit. "She isn't going anywhere, Julian. She's in the middle of a medical crisis. Moving her now would be a death sentence." "The state has its own facilities," Ms. Henderson said, her voice a flat monotone. "Mr. Vane has been very helpful in pointing out that this private wing is not an authorized shelter for minors. We have a transport team waiting downstairs. They'll take her to the regional holding center." Arthur knew that holding center. It was a grey concrete box on the edge of the city, a place where children were processed like cargo. In this weather, with Maya's weakened lungs, she wouldn't last 48 hours. "I know what you're doing," Arthur said, turning his gaze back to Julian. "You're trying to bury her. You think if she disappears into the system, the link to Sterling Global disappears with her. You think you can protect the merger by erasing a little girl." Julian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I'm protecting your legacy, Arthur. The legacy you're currently trying to set on fire. The board is meeting in 3 hours to discuss your fitness as CEO. If you don't hand this girl over and get to the gala to sign those merger papers, you'll be out on the street with her. And trust me, I'll make sure your personal assets are frozen so fast you won't be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay for a private hospital wing." It was a total declaration of war. Julian had spent years learning Arthur's moves, and now he was using them against him. He had the board, he had the city officials, and he had the cold, hard logic of the bottom line. But Julian had made one mistake. He assumed Arthur still cared about the towers. "Leave," Arthur said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, delivered with the weight of 30 years of absolute power. Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Or what? You have no standing here, Arthur. I've already filed the injunction. By tomorrow morning I'll be the acting CEO and you'll be a cautionary tale." "I said leave," Arthur repeated, stepping toward Julian. The 2 men in suits shifted, but Arthur didn't even look at them. He looked into Julian's eyes and saw the hollowness there. It was like looking into a mirror of his own past, and he hated what he saw. "If you touch her, if you even move a single one of those machines, I will spend every second and every cent I have left to ensure you never see the sun again. Do you think I don't know about the clean-up crews, Julian? Do you think I haven't seen the reports you tried to hide?" Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "You have no proof of anything." "I have enough," Arthur lied. He didn't have the proof yet, but he knew where it was. He could see it in the way Julian's jaw tightened. "Now, get out of my sight before I decide to start the fire right here." Julian signaled to his team, and they retreated, but the look he gave Arthur was one of pure, venomous promise. "The gala is in 3 hours, Arthur. Make your choice. The girl or the Empire. You can't have both." The doors closed, and the room was silent once more, save for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Arthur turned back to Maya. She was watching him, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't understand the corporate politics or the billion-dollar stakes, but she understood the tone of a predator. "Are they coming back?" she whispered. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and took her small, frail hand in his. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a titan of industry. He felt like a man who had finally found something worth building. "No, Maya, they aren't coming back, I promise." But as he sat there, he knew he was trapped. Julian was right about one thing. The board was waiting. The legal documents for the merger were sitting on a mahogany table in a ballroom across town, waiting for his signature. If he didn't show up, the coup would be completed. He would lose everything: the money, the influence, the very buildings that bore his name. He looked at the locket again. To save Maya, he couldn't just stay in this hospital room. He had to go into the heart of the beast. He had to face the people he had spent his life impressing and show them the rot beneath the gold. But there was a problem. A big one. Elias, his fixer, sent a final encrypted message to his phone. It contained a single audio file and a set of coordinates. Arthur, you were right. Vane didn't just ignore the girl. He ordered the demolition of the community center while he knew there were people inside. He wanted to force the infestation out by any means necessary. The audio is a recording of the security head questioning the order. Vane's response? Let the winter do the work for us. Arthur felt a coldness settle in his chest that no heater could touch. It wasn't just negligence. It was attempted murder. Julian had knowingly left a 7-year-old to freeze to death to save a few $1,000s on a relocation budget. He looked at Maya, who had fallen back into a light, fitful sleep. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, the skin finally starting to feel warm. The king is coming back, Maya, he whispered. But he's not bringing the spring. He's bringing the storm. He stood up, adjusted his salt-stained coat, and walked out of the room. He didn't call his driver. He didn't call his assistant. He walked toward the elevators with a singular burning purpose. He had 3 hours to destroy a lifetime of work, and he wouldn't waste a single second. But as he reached the lobby, he saw a black SUV idling at the curb. It wasn't his. It was the same model used by Julian's private security. They weren't going to let him get to the gala. They were going to make sure the Iron Architect stayed buried in the snow he had tried so hard to ignore. Arthur Sterling took a deep breath, the cold air of the lobby biting at his throat, and stepped out into the night. The final confrontation was here, and only one of them would walk away from the glass castle. What happens when a man who has everything realizes it's all built on a lie? Does he run, or does he tear it all down to find the truth? Stay with me for the final part of this incredible journey, where the towers will fall and a new life will begin. Don't forget to leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your support means the world to me. The wind outside the hospital was no longer just a weather pattern. To Arthur Sterling, it felt like the breath of an old god, cold and indifferent, waiting to see if he would finally break. He stood on the sidewalk, his salt-stained coat flapping like the wings of a fallen bird. The black SUV was still there, idling like a predator in the tall grass. 2 men stepped out, their faces obscured by the shadows of their caps. They were professionals, the kind of men Arthur had hired 100 times to ensure smooth transitions at his construction sites. Now, they were here for him. Mr. Vane says it's time to go to the gala, sir, one of them said, his voice flat. It wasn't an invitation. It was an escort to a funeral, either for Maya's future or Arthur's legacy. Arthur looked at them, and for the first time in 30 years he felt a strange, intoxicating sense of peace. He wasn't the Iron Architect anymore. He was just a man with a silver locket in his pocket and a debt to pay to a woman he had failed a lifetime ago. He didn't fight them. He didn't argue. He simply walked toward the car. But as he sat in the back, he wasn't looking at the city's lights. He was looking at his phone, his thumb hovering over a single file Elias had sent him. The storm was coming, and he was the one who was going to let it in. The crystal ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sanctuary of excess. Hundreds of the city's most powerful people were gathered under massive chandeliers that dripped with light like frozen rain. There was laughter, the clink of expensive crystal, and the smell of perfume that cost more than most people made in a month. At the center of it all stood Julian Vane. He was in his element, holding a glass of vintage champagne surrounded by investors who were ready to sign away billions. He looked like the king Maya had spoken of, cold, untouchable, and victorious. When the heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open, a hush fell over the crowd. Arthur Sterling walked in. He didn't look like the man they knew. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was still in the same suit he had worn when he knelt in the dirty slush. It was wrinkled, stained with salt, and smelled of the hospital and the street. He looked like a ghost at a feast. Julian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned into chips of flint. He stepped forward, intercepted Arthur, and whispered through clenched teeth, "You look like a disaster, Arthur. Go to the green room and change. I have a suit waiting for you. Don't ruin this. The papers are on the podium. Just sign them and we can forget tonight ever happened." Arthur looked at him, his gaze steady. "You're right, Julian. Tonight is a night we should never forget." Without another word, Arthur walked past him. He didn't go to the green room. He walked straight to the stage. The murmurs in the crowd grew into a dull roar of confusion. The Iron Architect looked broken, his hair messy, his hands bare. He reached the podium, where a thick leather folder contained the merger documents, the culmination of his life's work. He didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he leaned into the microphone. "For 30 years, Arthur began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom, I have built this city. I told myself I was an architect of the future. I told myself that the people I displaced, the neighborhoods I erased, were just the price of progress. I lived in a castle of glass, so I wouldn't have to hear the sound of the world I was breaking." Julian signaled to the security at the sides of the room, his face turning a deep, angry red. "Arthur, stop this now," he shouted, but Arthur didn't stop. "Today I found a girl," Arthur continued, his voice growing stronger. "She was 7 years old, barefoot in a polar vortex, dying in the basement of one of my high-rises. She was there because we tore down her home and closed her clinic. And she was there because my protégé, Julian Vane, decided that her life was a liability to our profit margins." The room erupted. Julian lunged for the stage, but Arthur hit a button on the podium's control panel. The massive LED screens behind him, usually reserved for glowing architectural renders, flickered to life. It wasn't a skyscraper that appeared. It was a photo of Maya's feet, blue, bruised, and frozen. The image was so stark, so visceral, that several people in the front row gasped and looked away. And then a sound filled the room. It was the audio recording from Elias. "Let the winter do the work for us," Julian's voice rang out, clear and chillingly indifferent. "If she freezes, the problem solves itself. No paperwork, no PR, no costs." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside. Julian froze at the edge of the stage, his hand outstretched, caught in the glare of the spotlight like a thief. The investors pulled back from him as if he were diseased. The king was naked, and the crown was made of ice. "I will not sign these papers," Arthur said, looking directly into the cameras of the press corps at the back. "Tonight I am resigning as CEO of Sterling Global, but before I go, I am exercising my majority shareholder rights. I am liquidating my entire personal estate and my shares into a trust. This trust will not build luxury towers. It will rebuild the clinics, the schools, and the homes we destroyed. I am bankrupting the Iron Architect to pay for the sins of the man I used to be." He turned to Julian, who was being approached by 2 plainclothes officers who had been waiting in the wings, tipped off by Elias. "The winter didn't do your work, Julian. It did mine. It woke me up." Arthur walked off the stage. He didn't wait for the applause because there was none. There was only the stunned silence of a room that had finally been forced to look at the ground. He walked out of the Drake Hotel, out into the biting Chicago wind. But this time, he didn't feel the cold. He felt the weight of the silver locket in his pocket, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt like he could breathe. The story didn't end in that ballroom. It ended 3 months later. The Chicago winter had finally broken. The iron-grey sky had given way to a soft pale blue, and the scent of damp earth replaced the smell of exhaust and ice. In a small, quiet neighborhood on the south side, one of the neighborhoods the Sterling Trust was currently revitalizing, there was a modest house with a small front yard. Arthur Sterling sat on the porch. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans. His hands were calloused, not from holding a pen, but from the actual labor of planting. He was no longer a billionaire. He lived on a modest pension, his fortune gone to the thousands of families he had once ignored. He was older, his hair completely white, but the hollow look in his eyes had vanished. "Arthur, look!" A small figure came racing around the corner of the house. It was Maya. She was no longer a ghost of the snow. Her cheeks were pink with health, and she was wearing a bright yellow coat that matched the sunshine. She ran with a slight limp. The doctors said she would always have a reminder of that night, but she ran with a joy that was infectious. She stopped in front of him, holding a small sapling in a plastic pot. "It's time to plant the tree," she said, her eyes shining. Arthur stood up, his joints aching in a way that felt real and honest. He took the shovel and walked with her to the center of the yard. Together, they dug into the soft, thawing earth. They placed the sapling into the ground, a maple tree that would one day grow tall enough to shade the entire street. "My mama said the king would bring the spring," Maya said, as she patted the dirt around the base of the tree. She reached up and touched the silver locket, which Arthur had polished until it shone like a mirror. It now hung around her neck, a symbol of a promise kept. Arthur looked at her, and then he looked at the street. He saw children playing, neighbors talking over fences, and the clinic down the block that was finally open again. He wasn't an architect of towers anymore. He was an architect of a community. "The king didn't bring the spring, Maya," Arthur said softly, kneeling down to her level. "You did. You brought the warmth back to a heart that had been frozen for far too long. The final shot of our story isn't a skyscraper touching the clouds. It's a close-up of that silver locket, resting on the mantel inside the house next to a new photograph. It isn't a photo of a boardroom or a gala. It's a photo of Arthur and Maya, standing in the sun, smiling. They are finally warm. True wealth isn't measured by the height of the towers we build, but by the depth of the mercy we show to those at our feet. Arthur Sterling lost an empire, but he found his soul in the eyes of a barefoot girl. And in the end, that was the only legacy that ever mattered. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and give it a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. I read every single one of your messages, and they mean the world to me. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.